Hey, it's Matthew Cudmore, Story Behind the Stone, a show where we talk service, sacrifice, and story, connecting you to the individuals that are changing the way the world remembers and veterans' causes and commemorations around the world. Our guest today is Jason van Bruggen, a Dutch-Canadian visual artist whose work has been featured on CNN, BBC, PBS, CBS, CBC, and his commercial work includes work with Adidas, Canada Goose, Patagonia, and Arc'teryx. We sat down with Jason to talk about his latest project, 80 Faces of Freedom and 80 Years of Freedom. After years of solitary work, tracking down, photographing, and interviewing strangers ranging in age from 85 to 108, this is a project very close to his heart that's now making its way around the world. It's a multimedia narrative, a warning, an inspiration, and a permanent reminder exploring World War II, the liberation of the Netherlands, and the profound impact of totalitarianism on occupied civilian populations. We'll include more details in the show notes. The project launches this month in April in the Netherlands from north to south, 14 locations along the Liberation Route. On May the 12th, Princess Marguerite of the Royal Family of the Netherlands will help to open the exhibition in the Greater Toronto area, and the documentary will premiere at festivals across North America, including the premiere in Canada on May the 18th at the Toronto Hot Dogs Festival. Jason, it's amazing to see this project come to life after years of solitary work, interviewing, taking photographs of all these individuals that survived the occupation of the Netherlands in World War II, their personal stories, and the impacts on them and their families of that occupation. We're so thrilled for your success. Thank you for sitting down with us. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in.
Okay, welcome to the show where we talk service, sacrifice, and stories, connecting you to the past and the most interesting people in the field of veteran causes and commemoration. My name is Ryan, along with my two co-hosts today, Matthew and Matt. And we're with Memory Anchor, and we're a company that is committed to using technology for good as we work to change the way the world remembers. Today, we're talking with Jason, and he's with the 80 Years of Freedom Project. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thanks for having me, guys. Great to be here.
Yeah, Jason, it's great to see you again. And we've seen the project kind of evolve over the last year. Lots to go over there. But before we get to 80 Years of Freedom, would love just to hear how you got started. And I think what you're calling your fourth chapter, your fourth career.
I am a visual artist, as you identified, and it's been a long journey to get to this phase. I'm in the sort of third quarter of my life, and I don't know how many careers I have in front of me, but I'd be a lot more successful if I didn't keep switching jobs. But I'm sort of driven. I'm driven by curiosity, and I'm driven by human interest. I'm driven by a concern over the state of the world. I think all of these things are coming into sharper focus for me as I age, and these days I'm really focused on legacy. What are the things that I can leave behind that have greater meaning than myself, that my kids can be proud of, that other generations that I'm sort of in touch with somehow can look at and say, well, that guy did his part.
Yeah.
Because I think we're at a sort of a bit of a crossroads as a species right now. It's a troubling time in many respects, and I have a thesis on sort of why that is, and how the period we're in more closely resembles broader human history than the last 75 or 80 years have, where we've experienced sort of relative peace and freedom, and the emergence of sort of broader rights and economic freedoms. But we can touch on that later. Anyways, how I came to this sort of, I've always been interested in visual arts. I've always been interested in photography in particular. And I had sort of sold out of a business and had a bit of disposable income, not very much, but I figured I'd, invest in some cameras and try my hand at this, and gain some traction. And it's sort of taken off from then. It's been a very winding road, and I've explored different mediums of sort of visual expression, from photography to filmmaking, to commercial sense, to documentary sense. But the things that give me the most freedom, give me the most satisfaction and the most joy are these types of projects, these sort of like, broader sweeping documentary stories about important aspects of human or environmental history.
I looked through your long list of accolades, Explorers Club, Royal Canadian Geographical Society, TEDx speaker, Cannes Lion Grand Prix, Outside Magazine, National Geographic, like the list goes on. Is there any particular project that you wanted to touch on that you're particularly proud of?
I'm proud of the work that has touched people,
Mm.
at a sort of, emotional sense, and hopefully has changed human behavior. I think the world is very crowded with narratives these days, more so than ever. We're exposed to them on so many platforms, and it's really hard to sort of punch through and make people feel something because they are
Hmm.
inundated with content. So to a large degree, I measure pride in a piece of work by its efficacy, and I think that from that perspective, a piece I made a number of years ago, funded by NASA, which was about a polar scientist named Conrad Steffen, who has since passed away, is one of the pieces I'm extraordinarily proud of. It sort of documented the life of a polar explorer, a person at the largest data sample size on glacial melt on the entire planet, and was sort of the canary in the coal mine, in terms of the impact that melting glaciers would have on sea level rise and sort of human behavior, human migration patterns, etc. And then I think some of my documentary projects where I've explored the Arctic, the Canadian Arctic in particular, and great sort of at great length, and sort of lived the truth of people that reside in these remote parts of the world and how they're experiencing climate change and culture change
Yeah.
at a rate that is sort of unprecedented in human history. And then some of the work I've done in the Netherlands, which is my second home, I'm very proud of. I've done a couple of photo essays based largely on my parents' experience and my sort of intergenerational memory, to some degree my intergenerational trauma, these things. So they're all motivated by very personal reasons, and I think they've all touched larger audiences, being published on all sorts of networks and in various parts of the world, and being shown on TV from Switzerland to Australia to Sri Lanka, etc. So this is I hope that they've been thought provoking for people.
In all of these works that you're doing, you're going to such great lengths to document those stories, and I just think it's really special and should be congratulated. So I'm so glad that you're seeing that kind of recognition. What do you love most about your work?
It's such a privilege to do the work that I do. It's a very populated and competitive space, and I think it's a lot of the stories that I'm most motivated by and passionate by are largely unpaid projects that I've funded through the commercial work I've done, and that have allowed me to go and explore these sort of deeply human truths, at a more sort of profound level, and invest time and resources in them, and find ways to sort of bring them to life and to make them public facing. But the thing that I enjoy most is really, connecting with people and hearing their stories and sharing their truths and understanding, and trying to find a way to make that germane to people whose experience is very different. Because I think there are so many things that unite us as a as a species that are sort of forgotten. We live in a very sort of divisive and separated and fast moving world, and there are certain universal truths that do exist and that I hold dear. So my hope is to illuminate some of those and share them with broader audiences.
Jason, you were just talking about the range of human experiences that you get to be around, and I was just wondering if, as you go through your life and your process of selecting stories, if there's a way that you figure out or determine which stories you want to follow, which projects you want to take on, or if there's a long list that maybe are legacy ideas that you have, or just in general what your process is for selecting stories and projects.
Yeah, it's a great question. I have so many things that I care about. I mean, I've been to, I think, 150 countries. I've met people from all walks of life, and I'm a huge believer in being out in the streets and experiencing real life with unmediated by a tourist experience or by an interpreter or a guide, and just trying to sort of find your way. And I am so touched by so many of the stories I come across, these deeply human truths, these sort of moving narratives, the way that people survive and thrive in environments that you know seem so challenging for us, but are so full of richness and connection and opportunity for other people. So it is a long list, but I think it's when sort of that sensitivity that I have in that sort of repository of human experience meets opportunity or is triggered by something. There's an epiphany, and there's something that just sort of, compels me to move that idea and that narrative forward at the expense of others. So it's a complex sort of confluence of circumstances whereby that happens, but it's kind of one of those things where you have something, you have a thread that you just simply have to pull on. That's the time to do it, and it's often driven, I would also say, by what is happening in the world. What are we all concerned about? How is this experience, this geological or historical event, relevant to the conversations we as a broader society are having with ourselves at that very moment? Because I believe that people can learn something from other people, and sometimes it's important to sort of connect those dots and hopefully let people draw those lessons and reflect upon them.
There's actually one thing I wrote down while we were talking a little bit ago, and it was just, in caps, passion. And I feel like that's something that maybe is part of what calls you to tell those stories, but I think it's also clear that your passion for those stories comes through in the projects that you create.
If I can give you an example, this particular story, the one that we're discussing here, which is 80 years of freedom. I was at my recently deceased Aunt Famy's house, my father's last remaining sibling, and she was going through all these old photo albums, and she had a little box set aside of very special memories that were kind of, she would refer to more frequently than going to an album. And so she told me the stories behind all of them. One of them was a story of the time that I was in her house in the south of Holland, and she, I wanted to play with my little toy trucks in the sand, and there was no sand, so she took, mountains of sugar and poured them out on her floor so I could pretend that was, a sandbox. She was, a very special person to me, but she showed me a photo of herself and her best friend. They were dressed in, their best, well, their only dresses, really. It was May the 5th, 1945. May the 5th is also my birthday, it so happens. Liberation Day in the Netherlands. And these two beautiful young women were waving Dutch flags on the Regentessenstraat in Den Haag as the Canadian forces came by in their tanks and troop transports. And the whole nation was celebrating, freedom for the first time in 5 years. And that was so moving for me. And I was looking at this, 93-year-old lady in front of me, and then looking at this image of her, and I could see the likeness, of course, but, imagining the profound impact that had on her. And I just said, my parents had died. My parents had grown up during the war. And I just felt this immediate pull, this sort of almost, compulsion to go and bring these stories to life, and not from the perspective of soldiers, because I think that story has been told and well told by many people, by many historians, by many, artists and photographers and filmmakers. But the story of how the civilians experienced war, I thought was very interesting, and maybe had not been as sort of widely understood. And I think it's important as we are living right now through another time of sort of expanding conflict, specifically in Europe. And there are many sort of parallels between the beginning of the Second World War and the beginning of the Russian-Ukraine war that were disturbing to me at all sorts of levels. So I thought it was a very good time to remind people of what the experience of conflict was, how terrible it was, how dehumanizing it was, and how, how traumatizing it is to grow up, to live, to witness conflict.
Yeah, and I appreciate what you're saying there. And often when we think of commemoration and the experience in World War One, World War Two, or other conflicts, we're not always thinking of that civilian aspect. And kind of similar to your story, my grandmother grew up in Italy. She was a young woman in Italy during the conflict in World War Two, and just hearing about her experiences, about what day-to-day life was and how traumatic that was for her, and ultimately why she left Italy. That's not a story that's often captured in those books. And as I look at some of your pictures and the 80 Faces of Freedom, I love it. I love seeing the pictures of these faces, and yeah, I think it probably means something different to everyone. But on your website, with the 80 Faces of Freedom, those pictures you have there, what is it that you're trying to share through those pictures?
I think it's just, these people look like our grandparents, like, many sort of older people, but, you know, in many cases, there is something in their eyes, some sense of being haunted or something um, because they grew up in a terrible time. I mean, I use the example of my parents, they both lived during the hunger winter in Scheveningen and Den Haag, which were, some of the areas that suffered the most. Hundreds of thousands of Dutch people perished, as a result of the occupation and the shortage of food. And my father was sent away to a farm up in the north because there was not enough. His parents couldn't put food on the table for him. So, I think of the experience of both the children who looked at their parents and sort of, who weren't able to provide for them, and the parents who looked at the children and said, I don't have enough, don't have the capacity to take care of you in the way that I'm meant to. But I think it's, the civilian experience is as traumatic, of course, as the soldiers' experience. And I'm sure you have a lot of your colleagues who, were not the same after the conflict, and I think the same thing happens on the civilian side, the people that witness this, that they see the same gore, the same bloodshed, the same, you know, terror, and they also experience a complete loss of freedom and control. Um, I grew up in a household where there was never any food left on the table. We ate every scrap of every meal because my parents both starved as young people, and they never took food for granted. They never took freedom for granted. They were immigrants to this country, but they both voted, you know, at every election. These are things that they never sort of, um, you know, took for granted.
And like your experience though is you seen the cost that it has on these individuals who either lived through it. So like some of my buddies who were overseas in Afghanistan, or yeah, like my grandmother, coming back, you can see how that had an impact on the behavior. And I think that reverence for voting, like I don't miss out on a vote, or we don't take food for granted. I wonder sometimes is our ancestors that lived through that, what are those messages that they want us to keep? And if we don't keep them, are we doomed to repeat history and have to learn those lessons again? And I appreciate, and that's kind of, as you're talking and I'm kind of going through and looking at some of these pictures, and I see the pictures of your aunt holding the Dutch flag, and then just these other individuals. It is really beautiful to look at these pictures with that lens. Is what was that experience? What is that wisdom that this person has, and what would be that message they would want us to keep? And I guess we only suppose sometimes what that message could be for those who have passed on, but that experience with your aunt and being able to have those conversations, there's not many of them left, is there?
No, I think, and I say this with a huge caveat, but I think it was like 5 years ago there were 300 and something thousand people in the Netherlands that had survived World War II, and now we're down to like 50 something thousand, if that many. It of course decreases every day. Of the 80 subjects I've interviewed, a number have passed in the last 2 years. Yeah, the number is small and getting smaller, and with them, of course, these memories die. And I think my parents never wanted to speak about the war. My father, especially, they come from a generation where it, they weren't encouraged to sort of express those feelings or seek help for the, nightmares they had or anything. And, um, I interviewed a number of subjects who said exactly that. They had some form of, post-traumatic stress, and it was sort of dismissed. Leave it alone. It's in the past, etc. So I think, but I did ask, everyone if they had a message for sort of people today about, and universally they sort of said never again. We can't let this happen again. But of course, human history shows that every number of generations there are these massive conflicts where, impact the civilian population and to sort of, kill hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And, decades later, we're at it again. So I don't know that we learn from our own history. But I think that, you know, given the technology we have at our disposal, there's every opportunity to share those lessons with people. And hopefully that has some impact and encourages people to sort of reflect upon that more closely, especially as it, becomes generations removed from their own experience.
Yeah, fingers crossed for sure. And I just wanted to take a step back to something you said a moment ago, how there was a lot of, like, I don't know, inward focus, I suppose, like people that didn't necessarily want to express the trauma, work through the trauma that they'd experienced. When you were doing your 80 interviews with these individuals all over the Netherlands, did you experience any, like, pushback? Were there people that just didn't want to talk about it? Did you have to employ any tactics, or did they see the importance of sharing their stories at this point in time?
Yeah, some were reluctant. I mean, they know I've been vetted, right? Someone had asked on my behalf, or I'd asked directly if they were willing to speak about it. So you walked into a warm room inevitably, but the level of detail and sort of personal experience that some wanted to share was vastly different from what others wanted to share. But I found once you got them talking, it was they were very happy to do so. Um, but yeah, some people cried, and some people hadn't talked about these things with their children who were present. And you saw this sort of this moment where kids connected with their parents' history and hadn't even realized the full extent of what they had sort of seen and what they had, experienced. So I think for many people it was a very profound experience, and many people expressed great gratitude that I had come and asked those questions, which I wasn't expecting. And inevitably I was, it's Dutch hospitality is certainly well known historically. You'd be served tea and in many cases people invited me for lunch, or I went out for lunch with them, and time permitting, some days I had 2, 3, 4 interviews. But I was really invited into these people's homes and lives, and welcomed as a witness, as a sort of raconteur, as a storyteller. And I was very touched by it. I was very honored that they shared those things with me. I felt very privileged, and I did my best to sort of build trust and complicity. My Dutch is fluent, but not well rehearsed, and not sort of, I would say, excellent. It's my first language, but not my best language. So it's a little bit bumbling sometimes, but I think that almost creates an informality that was maybe encouraged people to open up. I wasn't a slick sort of reporter from the local newspaper who had a list of preformed questions. I kind of went in with a very open-ended approach that allowed them to express themselves. So it was
It makes your interest more genuine, I think, when you have to approach it with a little bit more um, work than somebody else might be able to approach it.
humility, because the first words out of my mouth were an apology for my lack of proficiency in the language, especially in the regional dialects where people. I mean, I had trouble understanding many of the things that were said, as do people that live in North Holland when they go into Gelderland or the Achterhoek, into these sort of remote little corners of what is a very small country, but has a sort of very almost medieval sort of cultural mosaic to it that sees people from places adjacent to each other speak very different versions of the language.
It's really interesting that each one of these cities is kind of like its own little island in, in the polder, even, in these small little areas. But I did want to take another step back to what you were saying, that a lot of times, you were speaking to these individuals who had witnessed and experienced the war. And they were sometimes telling those stories for the first time in front of family members. Is there any one of those stories that sticks out, or like, were there any revelations that came about, or did that impact the family members that were sitting and hearing these in a way that maybe surprised you?
In some cases, I wasn't able to have a conversation with the family members subsequently. It was just my sort of gut that told me that these things were happening. But there were certainly people welling up with tears, and people who were very moved by the stories that their mother or father were sharing. I mean, I think the things that struck me most profoundly were, of course, many of the stories from Jewish residents, and particularly in Amsterdam, who'd been through the horrors and had lost, every member of their family but themselves in some cases. So that was very emotive for me. I'm trying to think of there is no single example of that comes to mind. I think they were all impactful, and everyone in the room, there was silence, there were tears, there was deep breathing, there was, sort of these profound moments of connection and affinity that I was lucky enough to witness. So. And facilitate, I suppose. Sometimes it takes an outsider to come in there and ask these probing questions for people to truly open up. I don't know what that, is in our nature that sort of sees that happening, but I do see it, time and time again.
Jason, how can folks in Canada and the Netherlands experience your projects?
Well, it's still fully taking form, but there is going to be a number of exhibitions in, I think, 7 or 8 musea in the Netherlands. We're talking about putting images in the city or the municipality of Bergendal, the city of Nijmegen, as well as, a whole bunch of museums in Friesland and 1 or 2 in the south of Holland. So that is sort of one, execution. And then there will be a exhibition of images and a series of permanent structures built in Mississauga. And then we're talking to Waterfront Toronto and other sort of parts of the city where these exhibitions and perhaps a number of permanent structures will be erected starting in May of 2025. I have a steering committee here in Toronto, and we operate as 80yearsofreedom.com. We have, members of the Dutch Canadian community. We have business leaders. We have representation from the military. We have the Dutch Consul General. A number of other people sort of sit, and we meet every 2 weeks and sort of steer this project forward. That's a great opportunity for people to go and contribute funding and other support. And a lot of information is contained there. And then there is also my website, jasonvanbruggen.com, where people can see these images and stories coming together. I have made a film, which will be slowly released in festivals over the next few months, that will also play at the Holton Visitor Center for the foreseeable future, starting in May of 2025. I'm working on similar initiatives with other memorial sites.
It's a lot of moving pieces. I don't know how you keep your head screwed on straight.
As always, it suffers from a lack of resources. This is self-funded largely. I've gotten some startup money from the Dutch government, which I'm grateful for, but I felt so compelled to make this that I once I embarked on that journey, I had no choice but to complete it.
Jason, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a little bit about your passion, your experience, really touching stories about your aunt and the impact that's had. And so sharing that experience and your work it's just been a really cool experience to sit and listen to that, but also go onto your website and take a look at the work you're doing. We're going to connect that to the show notes. So anybody here listening today, please check out the show notes. We'll have all the information and links to the work that Jason's been doing. And if you've really enjoyed this podcast, make sure to like, share, and tell people about it, because we want to get out the word of commemoration and veteran causes and all the great work that our podcast participants have been doing out in the field. So thank you once again, Jason, for everything and your time today.
Thank you, guys. It's been a really enjoyable hour. I appreciate your line of questioning, and I really respect what you guys are doing, and I wish you great success going forward. Thanks for including me.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Story Behind the Stone is available on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and on the Wreaths Across America radio network, on iHeartRadio, Audacity, and TuneIn. Just search for Wreath. We air every Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern on the Wreaths Across Radio Network. Thank you for tuning in.